Even at a young age, Pier Giorgio responded immediately to the needs of the weak. One day, seeing a frail woman who had knocked on the door with a barefoot child in her arms, he quickly took off his shoes and socks and gave them to her, and quickly shut the door before anyone in the house saw. Another time, in the nursery school that Pier Giorgio was visiting with grandfather, the children were having lunch at midday. Pier Giorgio saw a child sitting alone who had a bad skin disorder. He went up to him and shared his soup, wiping out the misery on the small, lonely face. In the evenings, Pier Giorgio often gathered wildflowers to take to his great-grandmother, who enjoyed these affectionate gifts from the little boy. One day, he met a lay worker in the garden. She had come from the nursery to pick a bunch of flowers for the chapel. Pier Giorgio ran up to her with a beautiful scarlet rose in his hand and said, "Sister." "I'm not a sister," replied the lay worker. But he continued on as if he didn't hear her. "Sister, take this rose to Jesus for me." Surprised at the child's look, she thanked him with a phrase that sounds prophetic today. "You'll see that one day Jesus will make you a saint." Pier Giorgio Frassati was born on Holy Saturday, April 6, 1901. He was born to a very prominent family in Turin, Italy. His father, Alfredo Frassati, was the owner of a very popular liberal newspaper, La Stampa. Later, he became an ambassador to the German nation. Pier Giorgio's mother was a talented painter. She showcased her work at exhibits, and even the King Victor Emmanuel purchased some of her work. Pier Giorgio also had a sister, Luciana, who was only a year younger than Pier Giorgio. They were very close, and although Luciana had very different goals in life than her saintly brother, they were like best friends and told each other everything. Luciana later wrote the biography about Pier Giorgio, and to her credit, that's why we know so much about Blessed Pier Giorgio today. Pier Giorgio's family was not religious. His father was agnostic and his mother was a lukewarm Catholic. Luciana, Pier Giorgio's sister, remembers, "Our mother and her sister Elena would not have missed Mass, but they were never seen by us to go to communion or to kneel and say a prayer." How, then, did Pier Giorgio develop such a rich Catholic faith? Already possessing a compassionate heart and generous spirit, he was naturally drawn to the apostolate spirit of the Catholic faith. At school, he received communion every day, and it is through this that Pier Giorgio grew in his faith. Unfortunately, his school, although Catholic, was not a very fervent one. Luciana says that she received superficial instruction and that Pier Giorgio had to insist to his instructor to tell him the life of Jesus. He wanted to hear the gospel. Pier Giorgio was able to make his first communion on June 19, 1911, and he was confirmed in 1915. His childhood was not a very happy one. Neither of their parents were inclined to show much interest in their children. If anything, they were treated as a burden to deal with. Luciana writes, "Our childhood was painful. Our days were strictly controlled and isolated. We were not allowed to walk the streets, stand in front of windows, or give way to little stirrings of curiosity. We had to walk briskly without turning our heads. Our father spent those years and many others engrossed in La Stampa. Conversations with grown-ups was non-existent and forbidden. Being nothing or worse, troublemakers, tempered our pride. We even suffered real hunger, presumably for the benefit of our health." Although both mother and father were strict with their children, and sadly didn't give them the affection they needed or deserved, Pier Giorgio never looked at them with bitterness. In fact, he admired them both, crediting them to his love for his outdoors and learning perseverance. His mother, a woman who believed in self-empowerment, taught him resilience by bringing him on long 10-hour mountain climbs. Once she brought him up to a 10,906-foot mountain, although he was still very young and had no special training. However, he enjoyed these excursions, and when he wasn't hiking with his mother, he would hike with his uncle all over the Turin Hills. His mother smoked pipes and cigars, a thing not heard of by a lady at that time. But Pier Giorgio was proud of his mother's smoking, seeing it as her way of relaxing. Pier Giorgio learned to appreciate the strong smell of tobacco. Neither my father nor I was permitted to express annoyance at that cloud of smoke, and if I complained, Mama retorted by calling me delicate, a sure sign of her contempt. Proud of his smoking mother, a custom unusual among women, my brother tried a cigar in the garden at Polene with his inseparable friend Camillo Benzatti. Camillo felt ill after a few puffs, but Pier Giorgio stood the test brilliantly. Later, he became an avid smoker of Tuscan cigars. If anyone asked him the reason for this bad habit, he would say, smiling, "Even my mother smokes Tuscans." Another time he boasted, "My mother smoked over me when I was being fed by the breast." He loved her even when she didn't treat him very well. His father, Alfredo, could be overbearing, critical, and arrogant. One would need to have a lot of patience to be around him. Luciana said, "As soon as her father slammed the door, I felt a sense of joy, for then I could interrupt my studies." Indeed, impatience was one of his instant prerogatives. At any small irritation, he created a whirlwind of tragedy around himself, but on the whole, he kept quiet and did not afford us a single glimpse into his life. But from his father, Pier Giorgio learned generosity. Alfredo was known to give substantial portions of his money to the poor and coal to employees who needed it. But giving money was as far as it went for him. He could not understand his son, who wasn't content to just give money to the poor, but his coat and shoes as well. This, in his opinion, was going a little too far and was bordering on being a religious fanatic. Alfredo had high hopes and big plans for his only son, but Pier Giorgio constantly disappointed him. For one thing, he was too religious. Alfredo couldn't understand this at all and viewed it as a weakness rather than a strength. One evening, he discovered Pier Giorgio by his bed praying the rosary. He didn't say anything, but inside he was fuming. He approached the parish priest soon afterwards and complained, "What have you done to my son?" The priest said, "Perhaps, Senator, you would prefer him to fall asleep with some cheap novel on his night table?" His other disappointment was that he felt that Pier Giorgio was addle-brained and slow to learn. It didn't help that in 1908, Pier Giorgio failed his exams. His sister had failed too, but being a girl, they didn't expect her to earn her living, so their concern and disappointment centered on Pier Giorgio. He felt their disappointment keenly. In one of his letters he wrote, "Dear Papa, I am confused and miserable and I don't know how to write to you. I saw how upset Mama was and I thought about you being upset too, and I don't know how to say I'm sorry. I am sorry that I had to stay behind, and I am ashamed in front of my friends and sister who got ahead of me. I hope you will believe in the sincerity of my resolve to study this year and try to make up for this as much as possible." His mother, too, disliked Pier Giorgio's distractions to the spiritual life. Observing her son's growing love for Holy Communion, she worried that such a habit of attending daily Mass would make him become what she called a narrow-minded Catholic, and she opposed his idea of going as strongly as she could. Pier Giorgio liked to help the servants around the house with their work. He would get up early to help the gardener's wife, whose husband was called to serve in the war, leaving her by herself. Pier Giorgio was a heavy sleeper, however, and in order to wake up in time, he tied a rope to the drawer of his bedside table, leaving the rope hanging outside the window. In the morning, the gardener would pull the rope, shaking the table, which would wake Pier Giorgio. But one day, Pier Giorgio was sleeping so deeply that he didn't wake up, and his mother, hearing the noise of the table rattling against the floor, hurried to his room and asked through the door what on earth was going on. "It's nothing," Pier Giorgio answered. Thinking the noise was coming from him stumbling around the room, she told him next time to turn on the light, for goodness sakes. After that, a new alarm system was put into place, a long bamboo cane which the gardener would poke him with. Pier Giorgio also loved poetry. This too was a stumbling block in his relationship with his parents, as they didn't understand this at all. He would wander around the gardens in the morning, dramatically disclaiming Dante or Shakespeare. The servants, accustomed to this daily habit, took it as a wake-up call to start the day's work. "The senator's son is sounding forth," they would say. As Pier Giorgio grew, he began to think of his future. While his mother and father imagined his life at La Stampa, Pier Giorgio was considering priesthood. However, he felt his parents' hostility to this, especially from his mother, who was growing more and more anxious as Pier Giorgio grew older. She conspired with Father Tito, in whose parish she had helped to set up a school of singing. She complained of her son's lack of interest in realistic life goals and that his head was always in the clouds, partially due to saying the rosary too often. She felt that the rosary should be reserved for feast days and that he should follow a routine like the rest of the family. "Is it true, Pier Giorgio, that when you are in your room, you pray for a long time?" Father Tito asked. When Pier Giorgio didn't respond, he went on, "Yes, your mother told me so. You are upsetting her, and she gets up in the night." This didn't stop Pier Giorgio from praying, but he did learn to speak less and less. He joined the sodality of Mary and found his support and consolation there, even if there was none at home. He didn't even make the sign of the cross at meals, knowing that it caused tension in the family. Instead, he made it at the door before entering the dining room, saying his prayer quietly. His mother, not knowing what he was doing, sighed and said, "There he is, lost in his thoughts. He remembers Mass times, but not meal times." Pier Giorgio lived his faith, but tried hard not to do it in a way that caused aggravation in the family. This could be tricky to do. One day, he came home late, and his father reprimanded him for not letting anyone know and causing his mother to worry. "But where I was, there was no telephone," Pier Giorgio explained. This was not a lie, for there certainly was not any telephone at midnight adoration. In his late teens and early 20s, Pier Giorgio became very involved in politics. Although his parents thought that he was slow and uninspired, he was quite the opposite. Pier Giorgio was very intelligent, understood politics, and was brave enough to stand up for others. He was very dedicated to works of social action that would unite people together in fellowship as a means of combating inequalities. He was an opponent of fascism and did not support the regime of Benito Mussolini. He even was once arrested in Rome while protesting alongside the 1921 Young Catholic Workers' Congress. He also joined the St. Vincent de Paul Society, an association dedicated to serving the poor. But all his parents saw was an overly zealous college student who had unrealistic views. He had decided not to become a priest, not because of his parents, but because he felt called to be a missionary. He especially wanted to become a missionary to minors, and for this, he went to school for engineering. This was another great disappointment to his parents. Although Pier Giorgio loved and admired his parents, no matter how much pain they caused him, he wouldn't allow them to control his life. His life was in the hands of God. Luciana writes, "Our father thought he could move him like a pawn with his strong will, which did not take other feelings into account. Pier Giorgio was a male heir, and the house of Frassati would lose its full glory without him." Alfredo Frassati wrote a letter to his son one day, when he heard from his social circle of Pier Giorgio seen entering and leaving churches on a daily basis. This caused him irritation. "You must persuade yourself, dear Giorgio, that life needs to be taken seriously. The way you behave will not do for yourself or your family, who care about you and are very distressed by all these things that happen too often that are painfully and monotonously repeated. I have little hope that you will change, although you really need to change immediately. Take things in an orderly way. Always think seriously about what you should do. Have a little perseverance. Do not live by the day as thoughtlessly as any blockhead. If you care a little about your family, you must change. I am very, very upset." Pier Giorgio had a great love for the poor and would often beg money for them. This came across as odd since he came from such a wealthy family. But Pier Giorgio never considered his parents' wealth his own. He had no attachment to money and never wanted to become attached. If given anything, he would give it to someone else who needed it more. His father would give him a monthly allowance, which, of course, he used for the poor. One time, his father gave him 5,000 lire, a very significant sum at the time, and Pierre knew exactly what to do with it. "I have a bank that gives 1,000%, he said one day as he went to the slums. He saved everything, not for himself, but as a means to give to the poor. He would often ride third class on trains or take third-class seats at the theater so he could use the money that was left over for the poor. "I travel third class because there isn't a fourth," he would quip to those who asked why he would choose such an uncomfortable accommodation. Even in his own bedroom, which was never heated, he used only a blanket or two. His mentality was to struggle for himself, to make things easier for others. When someone asked why he always gave so much to the poor, he explained, "I see a special light surrounding the poor and unfortunate, a light we don't have." Every day he would visit the slums where the poor were and the homes for the elderly. He paid back everyone he borrowed from and made sure to keep an account of all he owed. He also had a great love for the sick, and it was from them that he would one day contract polio, which in the end would kill him. And so, between his begging for the poor and sick, his religious practices, his work with the Catholic Action, and studying at school, Pier Giorgio was always busy and never bored. His sister writes, "In the years when Pier Giorgio was developing and extending his plans for social work, the threats of Marxism and positivist liberalism became daily more and more persistent. Pier Giorgio said to the young one day, 'The times we are going through are difficult because cruel persecutions of the church is raging. But you bold and good young people should not be afraid of this small thing. Remember that the church is a divine institution and cannot come to an end. She will last till the end of the world. Not even the gates of hell prevail against her.'" Not everything was always so serious. Known for his leadership and high spirits, a group formed around Pier Giorgio. This group contained both young men and women who went on excursions and little trips to the mountains together. Everything was done spontaneously, and there were no rules to belong to the group. All were friends in the group, both male and female. But one girl in the group, Laura Hidalgo, caught Pier Giorgio's attention. Her goodness and piety attracted him to her, but he felt he couldn't pursue a relationship with her, knowing his parents wouldn't approve. His mother had also developed much sensitivity and anxiety over the years, and on top of this, his parents' marriage was suffering, and they were on the brink of separation. Pier Giorgio didn't feel that he could put this added burden on his parents. He went to his sister, his confidant, about this problem, and she had wrote to her fiancé about it. "Yesterday evening, he came to see me with his great big black eyes and told me he was in love with a girl I know. Of course, I have said nothing to Mama because it would be the final blow. Poor boy. It was moving to hear him speak. I told him to try not to see her. He told me he had already tried and said, 'If I go to the mountain on Sunday, she will be there too. How can I not go? Should I telephone her? Write to her?' Poor boy. I looked at him and realized it needed all his goodness, all his uprightness to act that way." For his mother, he abandoned his feelings for Laura and his hopes for any future with her. "I am the one who is sacrificed," he told Luciana more than once. He believed this with all his heart because he believed it was the will of God, and he surrendered his will to him. In January of 1925, Pier Giorgio's cross grew a little heavier as his sister got married. Although months had gone by since he let go of his love for Laura, Luciana's marriage and parting from the family brought back the sting. He writes to a friend about this struggle. "And how is your life going? Mine, as you can guess from the beginning of this letter, is perhaps going through the most acute period of severe crisis. And just at this moment, my sister is going far away, and so it will be my duty to be cheerful at home and suppress the gray mood caused by all the opposition I encounter. I shall be cheerful on the outside to show my companions not sharing our ideas that you can be a Catholic and still be young and happy, but internally, when I'm alone, I give way to my sadness." Things were very difficult at home without his sister. for his parents no longer even talked to each other. Pier Giorgio felt that he had to make up for the two. His mother's sensitivity had reached the extremes and made it so hard that the tiniest thing upset her and strained every relationship possible. This made the gap between mother and father even wider, making life at home miserable. At Luciana's wedding, Alfredo had a strange vision. He, who didn't believe in the supernatural, was granted a glimpse of the future to come. Did I ever tell you about the vision I had at the Archbishop's house on the day of Luciana's wedding? When I went into the hall where the altar stood, in its place I saw a bier that would destroy everything. How, I did not know. I did not see, did not feel, but I did understand everything. And for the first time in my life, I felt faint. For a second, perhaps less, I lost consciousness. This vision shows that the bier would be the foreboding of Pier Giorgio's death. After his sister's wedding, Pier Giorgio went back to his mountain climbing and his latest hobby, skiing, which he loved. On his last climb in June of 1925, his friend Guido, who had gone with him, recalls the day and how much fun it was, as they had discovered a new route on a mountain they had climbed before. They were unable to go on this new route, but promised each other they would come back. Pier Giorgio wrote to his sister, "If the Sunday trip had been completed, it would have been a victory because we have baptized a new route. In fact, from researches made, it appears that no one has ever been up it, only down. At any rate, we shall return some Sunday, armed with more gear. And if we have the honor of the first ascent, we could call it the Sinister One's route or something." This would never happen because Pier Giorgio would die in less than a month. Pier Giorgio's grandmother had lived with the family and was dying. This took all the focus and energy of the family, and unfortunately, this is exactly when Pier Giorgio began to feel ill from polio, although he didn't know he had it. His last days were sheer physical and moral torment, but he was too humble and self-denying to mind the indifference of others. No one took any notice of him. Even I, although I had some intuition, was certainly not aware. "Pier Giorgio is vomiting and has a temperature," I told our mother, who had always said these two symptoms together are alarming. But Mama was overwhelmed by her grandmother's dying. Despite being very ill, he walked to the nearby parish to get the priest for his grandmother. But when he came back home, he found out that they had already given her the last rites when he wasn't there. This, combined with how sick he was feeling, was a blow for Pier Giorgio. Luciana writes, "He heard about it and burst into tears because he had been excluded at such a moment. He leaned against the doorpost and could not calm down. Then he went to bed." At his grandmother's last hour, Pier Giorgio dragged himself from his bed to say goodbye. His sister recalled that he looked even thinner than he had that morning. Uncomfortable in his own bed, Pier Giorgio spent the night stretched out on the family's pool table. His mother, still unaware of how sick he was, complained when she saw him lying around, saying, "It seems impossible that whenever you are needed, you are never there." She didn't know that he had already fallen 3 times when he went to pray in the room where his grandmother's body was laid out. On Friday morning of the funeral, Pier Giorgio was partially paralyzed and unable to get out of bed. Still, the family didn't realize how very sick he was, and they left for the funeral. His mother decided at the last minute to stay home, not so much to take care of him, but to take a nap. Pier Giorgio could have chosen a better time to be ill, was her greeting to his friend Marco, who had come to visit. It was at the cemetery, right after putting the coffin in the grave, when they received a phone call from home that Pier Giorgio was very ill. Somehow, finally, their mother understood that Pier Giorgio was dying. They rushed home, but the only thing on Pier Giorgio's mind was the items in his jacket pocket that he was going to deliver to the poor that day. He was worried they would never get them. He insisted on writing a note himself, although his hand was half paralyzed. It said, "The injections are for Converso, and the pawn tickets belong to Sapa. I had forgotten it. Please renew it on my account." This note was delivered immediately, and this is how word spread that Pier Giorgio was very sick. Soon, the house was swamped with visitors, but his mother sent them all away, worried about contagion. The doctor had confirmed the diagnosis of polio. Even the archbishop, who was friends with Pier Giorgio, dropped everything to come and see him, but he too was sent away. It soon became evident that Pier Giorgio was in his last hour, and Luciana persuaded her mother to let the people come say goodbye. She relented. Luciana writes, "The doors began to open to let in new faces, unknown to us as was his life. The throng of silent people, their faces blank or wet with tears, went into him, touched him like a relic in front of us who had ignored him for years. It was from these unknown people that we received our greatest lesson." As people continued to file past Pier Giorgio, he died in his mother's arms. It was July 4th, 1925. He was 24 years old. At Pier Giorgio's funeral, thousands of people came, most of them his family had never met. They were the poor, the sick, the lonely, the forgotten, all whom Pier Giorgio loved. I could not imagine life without my brother. A blind man wanted to touch the coffin, another struggled to reach his benefactor. The crowd pressed around his mortal remains. Some wept, some prayed, while that coffin, without a single flower, seemed to rock above a tide of heads. When the bearers changed, the coffin tilted, and our Giuseppe Casone remembers the desperate tenderness of our father's gesture to keep it from falling. At last, Pier Giorgio's greatness was being realized by his family, who had only believed in worldly success. Through the inspiration of their son, Pier Giorgio's parents did not get divorced, but worked on their marriage, and both returned to the church. 80 years later, Pier Giorgio's coffin was opened for the canonization process. It was discovered that his body was completely incorrupt, looking exactly as it had the day he died. On June 12, 1978, Pier Giorgio was declared Servant of God. On October 23, 1987, he was declared Venerable. And on May 20, 1990, he was beatified. Just recently in April of 2024, it was announced that Blessed Pier Giorgio will be canonized sometime in 2025. A letter from his friend Clementina that was addressed to another friend right after Pier Giorgio's death was found. In this letter, she sums up Pier Giorgio the best. "I recognize now how unworthy I was to be near that soul, and the thought makes me tremble. May the Lord take into account the many steps he took to come to me and my mother's, to bring me greetings and his good wishes, his invariably serene words, the light of his kind eyes. Who will ever smile at us like that again? One could reveal any feelings to him and be sure not to be misunderstood. The only thing he did not understand was deceitfulness. This thunderbolt that strikes our deepest soul makes us realize clearly what our feelings and duties are. Let us cling to the cross and love each other in his memory as if and more than if he were still with us. Perhaps that way we shall see his smile shine among us again. O goodness, you are brighter and warmer than the sun, and you are eternal."